Well, the intertestamental period. I have enjoyed teaching this, studying it ever since I first learned about it, because it really opens up a lot of the richness of the New Testament. It helps explain where a lot of these things came from, helps you appreciate the landscape of the New Testament. And I had to go to seminary to figure it out, to read this stuff. I wish I had known more about it. But I think it'll help you as well. So this is that period that begins at the close of the Old Testament and runs until the beginning of the New Testament, hence intertestamental. But a lot goes on during this period, and so we'll cover it. And again, I think it'll help give you a good background for reading the New Testament. Well, when the Old Testament ends, the remnant of Jews have returned and they've rebuilt the temple, 515 BC. They've returned under Persia, under King Cyrus. And as the Old Testament closes in 430 BC, Israel, this once great kingdom under King David and King Solomon, is now just a small territory of land in this vast Persian empire. And of course, when we open up the NT, we see a lot of things that are new, right? Things have changed. We've got Roman occupation, Greek culture. We've got Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots. We've got Essenes. Where did these people come from? Well, let's begin with the next significant point in history during the intertestamental period, and that's with Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great was an amazing general, very young, and at a very young age, he had basically conquered the known world, and he had this vast empire to control. And the challenge is, how do you manage such a vast empire? Well, he did it through several means, but for our purposes, the main thing is that one thing he did was introduce Greek culture. And as part of a culture, you introduce the language. So you have a common language and a common culture that runs throughout the empire. So with Alexander the Great, we have the beginning of the Hellenistic period. And Hellenistic means things that have to do with Greek. Hellenism, so the Greek period. Now, Alexander wasn't Greek, but he was very much, he had an affinity for the Greek culture. So again, he has this vast Roman Empire, the spread of Greek culture throughout the empire. Now, when we talk about the Greek culture, let me talk a little bit about what that means, so that you appreciate what the Jews were dealing with in the first century with this pervasive culture they lived in. The Greek culture was known for its openness and tolerance. And as I read these, think about how this would contrast with the worldview of Judaism. Greek culture was known for its many gods and goddesses. It's what is known as polytheistic. Now, the core of Judaism is there is one God, right? And with Greek culture, the more the merrier. I mean, if you read some of the stories in the background, the gods, it didn't even make sense to have some of the gods that contradicted one another, but you could just put them all in one basket, so to speak, and have them for your gods, for your home. And again, just the more the merrier. Very polytheistic. The Greek culture, in this culture, it was they believed in the essential goodness of human beings, no concept of sin, forgiveness, or the need of repentance. And the worldview was very human-centered. It wasn't God-centered. Purpose of life was to be enjoyed, not to glorify God. And there's other things that could be mentioned concerning the Greek culture, but you get the idea how this would be in conflict with the worldview of the Jews in the first century. Let's get back to Alexander the Great, finish up that. He dies in 323 at the age of 33. So in only 13 years, he's conquered this massive, massive empire. And this empire is divided up between his four generals. And only two are important for our purposes, and that's Ptolemy and Seleucus. And the territory that they took would be controlled by them and their descendants. And so the Ptolemies controlled the land to the south of Israel, and the Seleucids would control the land to the north, and Palestine was kind of sandwiched in between. Now, initially, the Ptolemies controlled the land of Israel. So I know this is a lot to look at here. I pulled it off the internet, so I'm hoping you don't hear sirens of the internet police coming to get me for using this, but I'm putting attribution here for the Encyclopedia Britannica. But I think it's helpful for you to see a visual, and I could not find a good map of Alexander's empire. So to give you orientation here, this is the land of Palestine, right? You have Egypt down here, and then you've got the land of Palestine. This is, of course, where Paul would have had his missionary journeys. And so you can see this vast empire that Alexander the Great conquered. Initially, the Ptolemies, this area down here in Egypt, they controlled the land of Palestine. And the Jews had it pretty well under the Ptolemies. They just allowed them to live out their life. They could pursue their faith according to their convictions, and they just were pretty much left alone. And so this is the rule of the Ptolemies from 323 to 198 BC. I do want you to know that date and that name. Again, they fared well during this period. And also, just as a side note, I thought it interesting to note the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it was done during this time under the Ptolemies. Well, then, again, this is another map here, one that I took from Thomas Lessman. Again, this came off the internet. So hopefully you won't read about me in the paper for copyright infringement. But you can see here, again, this is the land of Palestine. And you see this Ptolemaic Empire controlling that area, right? Now what happens in 198 BC, this Seleucid Empire, the land, this is the dynasty under Seleucus, they take control of Palestine. And again, you can see, I hope you're getting orientation here. This was be Paul's journeys here up in Galatia and over to Greece. You have Rome over here. Now, the Roman Republic, Rome will eventually be the empire, right? The big empire on the block, so to speak. Eventually, they will control all this land around the Mediterranean, called the Mediterranean Basin. And that will be the Roman Empire. But not yet. So, go to the Seleucids. Again, from 198 to 164 BC, the land is controlled by the Seleucids. Now, the difference here is that the Seleucid Empire, they impose Hellenism, Greek culture, on the people throughout their empire, including the Jews. And the Jews have to figure out how do they deal with this imposition, right? Two groups emerged during this time, and I do want you to know these. The Hasidim arise, and the Hasidim wanted to just be left alone. They were not willing to compromise their faith. They were not willing to compromise with this Greek culture. In contrast, the Hellenizers, the second group to arise, they were willing to compromise with Greek culture. So know these two names. And also you'll note as we go forward that the Pharisees, if I can write on my screen here at a weird angle, will arise from the Hasidim, and the Sadducees will arise from the Hellenizers. Eventually, one of the Seleucid kings who comes into play here is our next, let me clear this up a little bit, is our next significant point in history. His name is Antiochus IV. He comes into power in 175 BC. Now, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and Epiphanes just means God manifest. He saw himself as Zeus manifested on the earth. Already gives you an idea about his attitude. But Antiochus, gosh, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but he did many things that created animosity with the Jews. The high priest position was chosen just based on bribery and other things. But the things came to a head when he set up a statue of Zeus in the temple. This was 167 BC. He offered swine. It was offered on the altar to a pagan god. And the Jews were forbidden to practice their religion. So this set off the Maccabean revolt. And this was in 167 BC. So I do want you to know that date there, when it started. Whoops, go back here. When it started. So the Maccabean revolt takes place under Antiochus when these events occur, when basically Judaism is outlawed. The event really started with Mattathias, and this was a country priest. He lived about 17 miles outside of Jerusalem. The representative for Antiochus IV comes into the town, and he wants to have an offering sacrificed to the king. Mattathias refuses, and another person steps forward and volunteers to do it. Mattathias, the priest, kills his fellow Jew, and he kills the king's representative. And he and his 5 sons take off into the hills and began this campaign, this war against the Seleucids. It was guerrilla warfare, very lightning strike, very fast fast strikes against the Seleucid army. They knew the land; it was their backyard, so they were very effective. Of course, others joined in to the revolt. Soon after this happened, though, Mattathias dies, and his son Judas takes over, and he was known as Judas Maccabeus. And it seems like Maccabeus means the hammer. Judas the hammer. Again, probably a nickname associated with the guerrilla warfare type tactics, the lightning fast strikes that they utilized against the Seleucid army. Well, 3 years of the revolt leads us to 164 BC when they take the temple. It is cleansed, and offerings are once again resumed. And this is still commemorated by the Jews as Hanukkah. This leads us to the Hasmonean period. So the sons of Mattathias rule in sequential order, various times, of course. And the Hasmonean period would have been made up of descendants of Mattathias. During this period, the Essenes also break away. This was an ultra-conservative, scrupulous about the law group, saw the priesthood as corrupt, saw themselves as the true Israel, and they withdrew into the desert and formed their own community. And this seems to be the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls that we found in the 40s near the Dead Sea in 11, I believe, different caves. Just a treasure trove of scrolls that have helped us linguistically, and also giving us a lot of great information about Second Temple Judaism. All right, so we have this Hasmonean period. Again, the descendants of Mattathias. I won't go into this in detail, but this is the period that leads up to the Roman period. So again, you have Mattathias' sons ruling, and then the descendants of Mattathias ruling during this period, 134 to 63 BC. You don't need to know these people and these dates. I won't go into it. It reads very much like a soap opera in many ways. Many times, in many ways, there's kind of a spiraling down of the dynasty, unfortunately, into violence and intrigue. But we won't go into all that. A very interesting time period. It's interesting to me, too, that the revolt took place so that the Jews could live out their faith, right? They rebelled against Antiochus IV. And yet during this dynasty, you see some rulers who were sympathetic with the Hasidim, who wanted to just be left alone and be faithful to their convictions. And some rulers were sympathetic to the Hellenizers, who were fine with compromising with the Greek culture. So it's just an interesting time. But it leads down to, we could pick up here with Salome, Alexandra. She rules for a while. We see the Pharisees first mentioned in this period. And then her two sons, when she dies, they fight for control. It does lead to a bloody civil war. Rome is now the empire. It has massive territory in the area, and the Roman general Pompey is not too far away. The date is 63 BC. He invades, and the land of Judea becomes just a client kingdom in this vast Roman Empire. So now we're in the Roman period. Rome is in charge. Now Rome, because of problems with the Hasmonean leadership, they allowed someone named Herod the Great to rule Palestine as king, and he ruled until 4 BC. At his death, the land was divided among his three sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. And you can see Archelaus was a pretty brief rule there. He was very wicked and caused Rome a lot of headaches because of the feedback and the pushback of the people under him. So he was replaced by a Roman prefect in AD 6. And the most famous governor that would precede him was Pontius Pilate, who ruled from AD 26 to 36 during the time, of course, of Jesus. Well, let's do a quick recap to kind of just catch our breath. We've talked about, of course, as the Old Testament ends, we know that Israel goes into exile under Babylon, and that's 586 BC. Whoops. And then we have a remnant that returns under King Cyrus, Persian king, in 539. They rebuild the temple, 515. And the Old Testament closes 430 BC. Right? And then we have this intertestamental period, don't we? Alexander the Great introduces Greek culture. And then very short time, 13 years goes by, his empire is divided among his generals. We see the Ptolemaic rule. They have Palestine from 323 to 198. And again, the Jews had it fairly good during that time. But then the Seleucid rule from 198 to 164, where they imposed Greek culture on Palestine, on the Jews. In 167, we have the Maccabean revolt because of Antiochus IV. And I do want you to know that name, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. They revolted. In 3 years, they were able to cleanse the temple and initiate the sacrificial system and begin offering sacrifices again. Of course, this is celebrated by the Jews, and it's known as Hanukkah. The descendants of Mattathias, this was known as the Hasmonean rule, and that leads us to the Roman period when General Pompey comes in, takes the land, and again, this is now just a part of this vast Roman Empire. So you can think about, they fell to Babylon, the southern kingdom, taken into exile. Then it was a remnant returned under the Persian Empire, and then eventually you have the period under Alexander the Great, and then we have the two generals, Ptolemaic rule, Seleucid rule, but then we have the Roman Empire. And this is where the New Testament picks up, of course. The Roman period really offered such an opportune time for the coming of the King and the spreading of the gospel. There was Roman peace, and by that I mean Rome was certainly battling barbarians at the borders of their empire, but within the empire itself, the rule and the authority of Rome carried with it a peaceful environment. There was civility, there was authority, there was rule of the law. There was a vast Roman network of roads that were built. And because of the pervasiveness of Greek culture, there was a common Greek language. But this opportune environment for the spreading of the gospel doesn't mean there wasn't a tension in the air either. This was a volatile time, and certainly a volatile time to be referring to yourself as a king or Messiah, or for others to refer to you in that way. This is the time of the New Testament. The people that Rome put in charge were to keep the peace and get the taxes back to Rome. And any talk of someone calling themselves a Messiah or king was put down pretty quickly and brutally. The Jews had to face Roman occupation of their promised land. They were paying taxes to Caesar. They were having to navigate this Greek culture, which, as we noted, was antithetical in many ways to their own convictions. And even within the Jewish faith, right, there was a division on how to deal with this culture. You had the Pharisees who wanted to be left alone and just simply practice their faith. The Sadducees who compromised and worked with Rome. You had the Essenes who withdrew to the desert just to form their own community. You have the Zealots who just wanted to blow the whole place up, right? And in the hearts and minds of all the Jews were the stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. And I hope you keep this in mind. Think about how the average Jew would have felt in the first century. Right? The story of the Exodus, when God delivered them from the Egyptians, would have certainly been in their hearts and minds. Stories of King David and the magnificent kingdom of Israel. The stories of the Maccabean revolt when Judas the Hammer and his comrades fought against the Seleucids. And they knew well the words of the prophets, of the many prophets who spoke of the hope that Yahweh their king would come to his temple to restore his kingdom and defeat the enemy, and he would set all things right. There was a hope of a Messiah, hope of the ideal king, one descended from David. And these stories were part of the fabric of their lives, of their hopes in the midst of this oppression. And this is the culture in which Jesus preached, where he taught, where he performed miracles. And eventually, in 66 AD, this powder keg of tension, it finally exploded. The Zealots, they got their wish. There was a revolt. Rome eventually destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. Many Jews fled to Jamnia, a nearby city, and the Sadducees would fade from history. The Pharisees would go on to develop Judaism according to their own understanding and interpretation, which is what became Rabbinic Judaism today. So I hope this background has given you some sense of the complex and the charged atmosphere of New Testament times. And particularly as you read the Gospels, I hope it's given you a richer understanding of the world in which the story of the life and ministry of Christ unfolds. I hope as we begin to work through the Gospels that you will be able to read the Gospels with fresh eyes and to see new things and to read it more deeply than you ever have before.